So with the early stages of the Marvel Cinematic Universe starting to take shape, our next major franchise would be Thor, coming at us in 2011. But before we can get into talking about Thor, we are going to go back to a familiar face, one that is known for his great Spider-Man works, this of course being Sam Raimi. Sam Raimi at the time, in late 1990, after the release of Darkman, actually got to sit down with Stan Lee and pitched him and 20th Century Fox his idea of a Thor film. Unfortunately, none of these talks went anywhere, and the film was pretty much abandoned up until April of 1997. And due to Marvel's bankruptcy, we got to see some of the most famous characters such as the X-Men, Spider-Man, and the Fantastic Four sold off. Next up was going to be Thor. Thor sat around on the wayside for a little bit of time, up until the 2000 release of the original X-Men movie. Excited by the prospect of having Thor appear in a movie, there was actually going to be a made-for-TV film which was going to be on UPN. Excited by the prospect of having Thor appear in a film on TV, a script was ordered. And they already had an actor in mind. Taylor Mane, who played Sabretooth recently in X-Men 1, was asked to star as the God of Thunder. With all this excitement surrounding Thor, in May of 2000, Marvel actually brought in Artisan Entertainment to help finance the film. And after this, another 4 years would go by till we would hear something else happening with the movie. Unfortunately, no studio was willing to give them a shot. In the early months of 2004, we would actually get the news that Sony Pictures Entertainment has actually purchased the film rights, and in December of 2004, David S. Goyer was in negotiations to write and direct the movie. David Goyer at this point has worked on numerous Marvel projects, one specifically being Doctor Strange, but we'll talk about that later. A year or so later, we actually got the news that David Goyer was not interested in doing the movie anymore due to the ongoing discussions with Marvel. He ended up leaving the project, which would mean that Sony Pictures was still slated to distribute the movie. The movie would pretty much be at a standstill till 2006, where Mark Protosevich was actually a fan of the comic book Thor, and he was asked and agreed to write the script. At this point, Sony had no interest in hanging on to the movie, so it moved over to Paramount Pictures. And this just so happens to be a perfect timing of events because that is the same year that they announced the formation of Marvel Studios, and Thor was one of the characters highlighted, with Paramount distributing a few of their movies. Everything would go silent again and fans started to worry, until December of 2007, where Mark actually gave an update on it. He said, "To be like a superhero origin story, but not one about a human gaining superpowers, but of a god realizing his true potential." After drafts of these scripts were complete and a few directors got to look at them, the initial job was actually offered to Matthew Vaughn in August of 2007. He took on the gig, but there was still a lot of work to do. Seeing that the script was way bigger than the money could afford, as to Marvel only had $525 million to work with for about 4 or 5 films, Matthew Vaughn would actually go on to rewrite the script to bring it down to the required budget of $150 million. The idea was for the film to start shooting in late 2008, except one problem. The original script was $300 million to produce, so there was a slight delay in production due to the fact that they actually had to scale back so much. But now, with the major success of Iron Man, Marvel Studios actually announced that Thor would be coming out on June 2nd, 2010, with Iron Man 2 actually being used to introduce the character of Thor. At this stage in the film, not everything was going as smooth as expected. Matthew Vaughn was actually released due to the holdings on his contract, which expired in May of 2008. Marvel immediately began to look for a new director. Enter Guillermo del Toro. And I kind of find it ironic that my number 1 and 2 favorite directors of all time were both at one point attached to this movie. Now, Del Toro once again was not estranged to anything Marvel, as he previously directed Marvel's Blade 2. And up until this point, he actually directed Hellboy 1, and Hellboy 2 just came out to great critical success. Del Toro throughout his life has been cited multiple times as talking about how much he loves the classic works of Jack Kirby and how much he loved to look at the comics. So for this, he wanted to focus on the character of Loki, and he wanted to incorporate a huge amount of the original Norse mythology into the film. The initial version of Thor, which Marvel and Del Toro agreed upon, would be really dingy Valhalla. It would be Vikings and mud everywhere, almost taking on a realistic approach. Unfortunately, Guillermo del Toro ended up turning down the directing duties to go and direct The Hobbit, which he would end up waiting over 5 years to do. Throughout the summer of 2008, it was pretty much one director coming in and not getting the job, up until late September of 2008, where Kenneth Branagh entered negotiations. Branagh, having experience working on films such as Hamlet, seemed like a perfect fit, and in December of 2008, he confirmed that he was in fact hired to helm Thor. And originally, he said that he was attracted to this movie because it was a human story right in the center of big epic scenarios. Now, due to so many delays and troubles with getting Thor off the ground, Branagh originally hoped that he could start filming in January of 2010, which means that Marvel would have to move back to July 16th, 2010 release date, and they moved it to June 17th of 2011, a full year later. The film would inevitably get one more move, which would see it moving to May 20th of 2011, so it wouldn't interfere with their other production, which was Captain America: The First Avenger. Now, with the director and a script set, it was time to find the leading man. Various people tried, and the first offer was made to Daniel Craig, aka James Bond. He turned it down due to obligations on the Bond franchise. The next major addition would happen in February of 2009, where Samuel L. Jackson, who is of course briefly played Nick Fury at the end of Iron Man, signed on to reprise his role as Nick Fury in Thor, and this was of course part of the 9-picture deal he had just signed with Marvel Studios to make numerous appearances. Later on, he was interviewed and retracted that, saying he was not actually a part of the movie. This was in fact supposed to be some sort of connective tissue scene that would bridge everything together, and that he was only listed as part of that due to a cameo. This would of course go on to become the post-credit scene, which included Dr. Salvik, the Tesseract, and Nick Fury. And this was the direct lead-in to the Avengers. A little bit of time would go on, and in May of 2009, we heard the rumors that Chris Hemsworth was in negotiations to star in the movie as Thor. Early on in this process, he was actually passed on multiple times along with his brother Liam Hemsworth. At this time, the only big role Chris Hemsworth was known as was playing James Tiberius Kirk's father in Star Trek in 2009. Another person who was also in the running to audition for the role of Thor was Tom Hiddleston. He did not end up getting the role of playing Thor, but he did end up playing his brother Loki. Tom Hiddleston was offered the job of Loki the next day, and he was officially the first one to be signed on. A few months would go by, and later it was confirmed by Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige that Chris Hemsworth was in fact cast as the God of Thunder, Thor. During this same time, Kevin Feige would go on to confirm that the movie would have two settings, one a modern day Earth setting, and the alternate would be of course the setting on Asgard. And another thing was also confirmed, that Thor's alter ego, Dr. Donald Blake, would not be used, and that he would not be making his appearance in any Iron Man movies as was originally intended. And in late July of 2009, it was officially revealed that Natalie Portman would be playing Jane Foster. She was of course previously known for her roles in the Star Wars prequels. And in another interview, Stellan Skarsgård would reveal that he has been cast in Thor. He did not reveal who he was going to be, but of course we would later find out that he was going to be Dr. Salvik, who would go on and have a reoccurring role in some of the Marvel movies. As the movie was gearing up to start production, a final addition was made in the form of Idris Elba taking on the role of Heimdall. Now, this was the first time Marvel would make a major race change to a familiar character from the comics, and this was definitely not taken lightly by people online, and it sparked many debates and outrages by fans of the character. With one day before filming started, Thor would have another setback. With the turmoil that was happening with Spider-Man 4, Marvel Entertainment decided to push the release date of Thor by 2 weeks to May 6th of 2011. Shortening the amount of time they would have to finish the movie by 3 weeks. Now, of course, as part of the exclusive deal that Marvel signed, they would have to shoot in Manhattan Beach, California. And in another cost-cutting measure, they would move production to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Just a few days after the camera started rolling, it was officially reported that Clark Gregg had officially signed on to reprise his role as Agent Coulson from Iron Man 1 and 2 for Thor. And in March of 2010, production would move to New Mexico, where there was an old-fashioned based western town which they would outfit to look like a more modern town to be able to do some of the shooting. The film would end principal photography on May 6th of 2010 and would enter the post-production phase. Once here, two companies were hired to do the visual effects for the movie, Digital Domain and BUF. BUF was specifically chosen to be able to recreate some of the photography done by the Hubble Space Telescope and give it that real-world look they were striving for in the MCU, yet also make it a unique thing that no one has seen before. Digital Domain was specifically used for the creation of Jotunheim. The visual effects companies also cited that the Bifrost would be a difficult task because they had no idea what they were trying to create and what the director was trying to convey before he could really sit down and explain it to them. Once everything was set in stone, the decision was made to release the film in 3D. After Avatar made this a huge success, pretty much everybody wanted their movies in 3D to also bring in more money for higher ticket prices. Kenneth Branagh originally said that the idea of making a movie in 3D made him cringe, but when he really thought about it, he figured that this could be another element to separate the movie and the fantastical element to something that the crowd has not seen before. The only problem being that Thor was shot in 2D, so it would have to have a post 2D conversion. And as is typical with these movies, in October 2010, a few months before release, we would get the official news that the movie was going to do some reshoots. During these reshoots, it was also important for them to go back and touch up the ice giants, which initially were not that big. They were only around 6'7". So Kenneth Branagh made sure he got an actor who was much bigger. They went back and digitally remade the frost giants much taller and more formidable. A few months would go by, and in April of 2011 it was officially confirmed by Paramount and Marvel Entertainment that the film would be getting an IMAX and IMAX 3D release. And one of the last scenes that was shot for the movie was the scene with Eric Salvig coming face to face with Nick Fury, which was directed by Joss Whedon on the set of the Avengers. The film did also have an original orchestral soundtrack. This one was done by Patrick Doyle. To this day, this is one of my favorite movie soundtracks of all time. If you have seen the movie, these tracks literally will run the entire scenes in your mind as you are listening to them. They are absolutely mesmerizing and perfect. If I had to pick one favorite track from this soundtrack, it would be the Sons of Odin theme. Now, much like all the Marvel movies up to this day, Thor was of course another movie loaded with Easter eggs. Clark Gregg once again reprised his role as Agent Coulson. And if you watch the movie right after you watch Iron Man 2, you will undoubtedly notice that this movie takes place at the same time as the third act of Iron Man 2. While his role was not as big as Black Widow's in Iron Man 2, this was our first cinematic universe debut of Jeremy Renner playing the character of Hawkeye. And another giant Easter egg that would be a hint towards the entirety of the Marvel Universe and building up to something giant was the inclusion of the Infinity Gauntlet, which of course along with that got us confirmation that Thanos does exist in this universe. And just like the two previous Iron Man movies and The Incredible Hulk, there was of course a Sega video game. Thor: God of Thunder would release a few months after the movie in September 13th of 2011. It would see releases on all the major home consoles, from the PlayStation 3 to the Xbox 360, the Wii, and the Nintendo DS. Overall, the scores were pretty much on the low spectrum of things. The PS3 and the 360 version got an average of a 2 out of 10. I myself own this game and I can say that it is truly awful. The Wii and Nintendo 3DS versions did a little bit better, averaging 5 out of 10. Now, the marketing for this movie had to be pretty huge. This was the first movie that wasn't Iron Man, and this was a very unsure thing. The Incredible Hulk, since that was a Universal thing, was not a true Marvel Disney property. So in July of 2010, Marvel Studios would hold the Thor panel at the 2010 San Diego Comic-Con, showing exclusive images and even some short clips and trailers. Unfortunately for them, this footage quickly leaked online just about a week later. Originally, there was also supposed to be an animated Marvel series consisting of 26 episodes based on Thor. This was later cancelled and reshuffled into a direct-to-video movie, Thor: Tales of Asgard. With everything going according to plan, Marvel would release Thor on May 6th of 2011. The film would go on to become #1 that opening weekend, and in North America it went on to make $181 million. Worldwide, it would also go on to have a total of $449.3 million, which would find the film as the 15th highest grossing of 2011. The film was a huge success. On the critics side of things, it did not fare as good as Iron Man 1, but it did far better than Iron Man 2. Thor would average 82 out of 100. So with the God of Thunder an official huge success in starting his own franchise, a month before its official release, Marvel was confident enough that Kevin Feige would come out and say that post-Avengers, Thor would continue on in a solo film series. But after the release of Thor, everybody had their doubts about the next film that was about to hit for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that being Captain America: The First Avenger. But the story of Captain America and to bring him to the big screen does not begin at this point. Instead, we are going to take a trip all the way back to the late 70s, where in the wake of DC's success with Superman the movie, Marvel would try to bring Captain America to film form. This was not a big success, but nonetheless, Marvel would stick to their guns and even produce a sequel to this, in form of Captain America 2, Death Too Soon. And Death Too Soon could not be a fitting title because the franchise at this point was dead. But that was not the end of Captain America trying to get his own movie off the ground. After the monumental success and the revolution of the superhero blockbuster, which we saw in Tim Burton's Batman '89, Marvel wanted to try again. This gave us Captain America in 1990. While this film was far better than the other two, there were still many problems and unnecessary changes that were done to it. Fans definitely did not enjoy this movie, and remains one of the typical movies you can find at a local comic convention for bootleg for very cheap. To me, this movie holds a special place in my heart because when I moved to the United States in 1996, my dad took me to the video store and I rented 3 VHSs. The first one being Back to the Future 1, which would be my favorite movie of all time. The second being Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, packing the first 3 episodes of the animated series. And the third being this specific Captain America movie. This was my first exposure to Captain America and I loved the movie. Over time, I've grown to see all of its problems and I'm definitely a critic of it and I do not enjoy it as much as I did when I was younger, but it definitely has a special place in my heart. So after the movie's released, it failed to really do anything to help save Marvel from the inevitable 1990s bankruptcy. And now we jump forward to 1997, where a distribution deal was made with Artisan Entertainment and Marvel was going to actually have a brand new movie. The idea of this movie would inevitably turn out to be Captain America: The First Avenger. But there were a few problems happening at Marvel Comics at the time. At first, there was a major issue with Joe Simon over the ownership of Captain America and who exactly created the character and who owned him in his current inception. Unfortunately, something that would become commonplace with Marvel distribution and character licenses, this movie did not materialize and nothing happened with it due to various lawsuits going on till September of 2003. For a couple of years, the movie just sat there as a concept with nothing really happening, up until 2005, where Marvel Studios got the loan to be able to finance and produce a bunch of films. Of course, the releases were going to be handled by Paramount Pictures. Now we are in the year 2006, where everything seems to be taking shape. Marvel has decided that they are moving forward with a brand new universe of movies. Unknown to them is if it's still going to be all shared or disconnected from one another. At the time, both Kevin Feige and the producer of the movie Avi Arad said that the movie would be a standalone picture because it would not fit into the current mold or ideas that people see films as. And this was of course enforced by the people that gave them the money because they did not actually believe that the idea of having to see multiple movies by different characters could all culminate in a huge success. Now at this point, the script was still very early in its design. The original idea was to save on the budget, so the movie would be half of it spent in World War II and half of it spent in modern day. And it was supposed to be one of those typical man-out-of-time movies, where we look at the character today and how he's evolved a couple of years after he was unfrozen, where then we would flash back to World War II and see the man that he was. Kevin Feige also at this time said that Back to the Future trilogy was a big influence on this, to see the evolution of characters and the time periods. And in February of 2006, he even said that he had someone in mind who he wanted to star, and definitely had a director in his mind, but he was not ready to talk about that yet. Later on in the spring of 2006, producer Avi Arad announced that they planned a summer 2008 release date. This was supposed to be the original release date of Iron Man 1. A few directors decided to approach Marvel to try to get the gig, one famous one being Jon Favreau, who approached him saying he wanted to make a pure comedy movie based in World War II. His ideas were rejected and he was instead offered Iron Man. A little more time would go by, and in April of 2006, David Self was hired to write the official first draft. During his initial interviews and getting to talk about why Captain America, he said because as a child this was his favorite superhero. His dad would constantly tell him that he could one day become Captain America if he chose to do the right thing. And that same month we would hear the first rumors that Joe Johnston has officially met with Marvel to direct the film. And right around the time everything was shaping up to actually meet their 2008 release date, everything went south really quickly. The film went on full hold during the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, which did not only impact this movie but was felt all throughout Hollywood in TV and films. Marvel, seeing this as a problem, tried to resolve everything quickly, and in January of 2008, everything was back to normal. The writers were back on working on Captain America. Unfortunately, the few months they had to take off from it would inevitably hurt the film. Fast forward to May 5th, 2008, after the huge initial success and the release of Iron Man in the United States, Marvel was right now at the height of their confidence and announced that Captain America, the First Avenger, which was at the time the working title, would officially release on May 6th of 2011. The movie was later pushed back to July 22nd. To make room for Thor. Now at this time, a few more directors would meet with Marvel once again. Jon Favreau offered his services but was ultimately turned down to be able to do Iron Man 2. Louis Leterrier, after his success on The Incredible Hulk, had meetings with Marvel but inevitably ended up not getting the job. And another giant span of time would go by until November of 2008, where officially Joe Johnston was hired to direct the movie. After being hired, Johnston was quick to hire a few of his friends, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely. Both joined the project to be able to do rewrites. Kevin Feige then would go on to say that the decision to add Joe Johnston was due to his directing ability on October Sky and The Rocketeer. And he also cited that his special effects work with the original Star Wars trilogy was very important, and that one of the big influences for the movie would be the look and feel of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now at the time that this movie was being produced, there was a lot of trouble with positioning Captain America as the face of Marvel. The United States at the time was trying to recover from various financial troubles and was still fighting a battle with a war that many of its allies disagreed with. And many worried that putting Captain America in the title of a movie would spell its imminent doom across the pond. At the time, many rumors and websites were reporting that the title of the movie was actually going to be changed to The First Avenger, and that Captain America would entirely be removed from the title. In an interview, when asked about how the anti-US perception of America is perceived and if they are worried about that, Kevin Feige said, "Marvel is perceived pretty well around the world right now, and I think putting another uber Marvel hero into worldwide box office would be a good thing." After that quote came out, producer of the movie Avi Arad also added, "Captain America stands for freedom, for all democracies, for hope all around the world. He was created to stop tyranny, and the idea of stopping tyrants is important today as it was then. So I think we will have some interesting challenges, but at the end of the day, if the movie is terrific and the movie talks to the world, it's not about one place, it's about the world, and I think on that basis it will be very successful." Later on, after the election of President Obama as the next US president, Kevin Feige would say, "The idea of change and hope has permeated the country, regardless of policies, and that includes Hollywood." Fast forward to December of 2009, where Joe Johnston was being interviewed, and he said the filming of the film would start in April of 2010, a little over a year from release date, which Marvel has been known to do. And he said that at the time, pretty much everybody that was in the pre-production stage right now in Manhattan Beach, California, were just sitting around trying to come up with the coolest concepts that they could do. And of course, with conceptual art, money and budget is not a problem yet. So once they got it, they could pick and choose what they wanted to keep and what they wanted to use later on. During another interview a few weeks later, he would give us an idea of what the movie was going to be about. He said, and I quote, "The film will begin in 1942. 1943, during World War II. The stuff from the 60s and 70s comic books we're sort of avoiding. We're going back to the 40s, and then follow to what they were doing in Captain America Now." And in February of 2010, during one of his big interviews, Joe Johnston stated that the invaders would appear in the film and would be featured in the entire second half of the movie. Now, of course, this would have to be a much different composition of the team, such as Namor the Submariner, who was at the time at Universal Studios. He would then start doing what most Marvel directors would become famous for doing, going back on their words and trying to say that he was misquoted. He added that there would definitely be a team of people that work with Captain America, but whether their name was the Invaders was up to debate. And then it was added on by one of the writers that the team was currently known as the Howling Commandos. Joe Johnston would then go on to say the design of the whole movie was to create technology that could be built in the 1940s, although they had to go fantastical with it since the addition and the use of the cube technology being integrated with it. And since Hitler throughout history famously has been known to dabble into the occult, and his fascination with advanced technology and aliens, this provided quick connective tissue to be able to link it up with Thor. But not only that, these prototype vehicles and projects by the Nazis that were never used were a direct inspiration to the vehicles that we see in the first Avenger. And later on, the vehicle designer for Tron Legacy was appointed the lead designer in all the vehicles in the movie. Johnston then went on and said he chose Daniel Simon due to his book Cosmic Motors. And he said that he was very influential into his reason for getting into the industry, and specifically many of his designs for Star Wars. A great example of this was when Joe Johnston said that the Red Skull Scar was based on two different Mercedes-Benz vehicles from the 1930s, the 540K and the G4. Now, ever since the original announcement that Captain America would become a feature film, many names throughout Hollywood were rumored or even auditioned for the role. Famously, one of Hollywood's big action star pushes at the time, Sam Worthington, was actually in talks. Along with that, we also heard and got confirmation that Will Smith was actually in negotiations. Just a couple of days before we would get the official casting, we actually had a list that leaked out of all of the shortlist actors potentially up to be offered the contract in the next couple of days. A few of the notable names on that list were Sebastian Stan, Jason Eccles, Channing Tatum, and Chris Evans. At the same time, we learned that there was also casting going on for Agent Carter. Allison Eve, Keira Knightley, and Emily Blunt were all considered. Blunt ultimately chose to decline the role, which would then go on to be played by Haley Atwell. And in March of 2010, it was officially announced that the former Human Torch Chris Evans was cast as Captain America, and that Agent Smith from The Matrix, Hugo Weaving, would be playing the Red Skull. Now, at the time, Captain America, by this point being my favorite superhero, I was absolutely outraged that Human Torch was going to be playing this character. Having seen two horrible Fantastic Four movies, which the Fantastic Four are my favorite team in comic books, I was absolutely enraged with this casting. And boy, am I glad to have been so wrong, because Chris Evans would become to define what Captain America is. Later on, Sebastian Stan, who was of course in the running to play Captain America, would become the Winter Soldier, aka Bucky Barnes. Now, this would go on to be a common thing with Marvel and their Disney movies, where the second and third choice would inevitably come back down the road in another movie for another role or something very close to what they were originally considered for. Just a few days after that, it was officially announced that the title has been changed. Formerly known as the first Avenger, Captain America, due to the markets, Marvel was going to stick to their guns and call the movie Captain America the First Avenger. And the day right after that was announced, Marvel Studios officially announced that Joss Whedon, who has recently been hired to direct Marvel's The Avengers, would see some of the rewrites for the movie as part of his agreement to work with Marvel. Later on in August that year, when he was asked how much of an exact input he had on the script, Joss Whedon would go on to say he just had minor character connections that he was working with. Joss Whedon said also that there was originally a very tight script that they were working with, so he went in there and he wanted to explore some of the relationship between the characters just a little bit more and insert a little bit more heart. Even if that made the movie slow, they knew it would pay off in the future. And that same month, Samuel L. Jackson would go on to reveal that he would be reprising his role as Nick Fury as part of his 9-movie contract. And in May of that year, there was confirmation that Toby Jones has entered final negotiations to play the famous villain Arnim Zola. And in that same article, it was announced by Jon Favreau, the director of Iron Man 1 and 2, that a younger version of Howard Stark would be appearing in the film, being of course played by Dominic Cooper. Over the next couple of months, we would get many more castings. Neil McDonough was officially cast as Dum Dum Dugan. Now when getting to talk about his contract, he said that he signed multiple contracts that were not necessarily just prominent for the movies. He said it might even be for television shows. On an interesting side note, a couple of years later, he would go on to become the villain of Arrow and also appear in Legends of Tomorrow. He of course goes on and plays the character of Damien Darhk. And the final major casting that would happen was Stanley Tucci as of course the creator of the Super Soldier Serum. Production on the film officially began on June 28th of 2010. On that same day, Marvel confirmed that Tommy Lee Jones was officially cast for the movie, and the fact that the rumors about Dominic Cooper playing a younger version of Howard Stark, whose character previously appeared in Iron Man 2, were also true. Along with this also came the announcement that the film would shoot in London that July, and that they had intentions to keep a bunch of the key locations from London. Now obviously, this being a film set during World War II, they needed to shoot a whole lot of war scenes. This lasted throughout the majority of September of 2010. And a big part of Liverpool was actually used to double for the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Other scenes that were shot in Liverpool of course included the inclusion of the Stark Expo. At this time, Joe Johnston decided to toss a huge Easter egg in there as part of the original rumors that the invaders were going to appear. And this is where we witnessed the Human Torch, the original android, appear in the movie. And at the same day that they announced that Thor would be getting a 3D release, Marvel also announced that Captain America the First Avenger would also be getting a 3D theatrical release. Joe Johnston says that he had one day to actually shoot with a 3D camera and he found it a nightmare, so he opted to shoot the movie in 2D with a post 3D conversion, as he found the giant clunky cameras to get in the way of the action sequences. He said, and I quote, "It was a nightmare." But instead of doing a cheap 2D to 3D conversion like most studios at the time were doing, Johnston opted to actually extend the post-production time of the movie, going in and retouching up every scene to make sure that the 3D was not flat. By November of 2010, word has got out that the filming of Captain America the First Avenger was officially over. And in February of 2011, it was officially announced that Alan Silvestri would officially be composing the film's score. And in March of 2011, it was officially announced that Captain America the First Avenger would be undergoing reshoots in the United Kingdom and around Los Angeles. And there was also a one-day shoot added to New York City in Times Square on April 23rd, 2011. In the post-production of the movie, it was revealed that the film has nearly 1,600 visual effects that were all divvied up between 3 production companies. One major contributor to this was an LA company called LOLA, who specialized in quote-unquote plastic digital surgery. And this was the main company and technique that they used to be able to take Chris Evans and make him look tiny. For the process of this, they also used a body double to be able to simulate what it would look like. They cited this as a long process, but in the end, it was all worth it. Now, one of the most important aspects of Captain America and one of the most recognizable was of course his iconic shield. 4 different types of shields were used. One made out of metal, fiberglass, rubber, and computer-generated graphics. The one specifically that was used in all the close-ups was the aluminum shield, and that was known as the Hero Shield / the Beauty Shield. Chris Evans would usually use one of the lighter ones for the movie, and of course then they would go over it in post-production with CG to add that metallic look. And speaking of post-production and heavy uses of CG, Hugo Weaving wore a mask for his portrayal of the Red Skull. The mask on set was very bulky and you could see that it was a clear prosthetic. There was an entire visual effects team just focusing on the Red Skull's mask, including manipulating it to have a more bony structure. They would thin out the cheek, remove some of the eye depth, make them more hollow, and of course manipulate the lips, while also making sure that the skin on the Red Skull was very tight. The original soundtrack, as mentioned before, was composed by Alan Silvestri, and they definitely went out of their way to make sure that it had the feel of a 1940s marching band and that it reflected Captain America's nature. The soundtrack did also include the Star-Spangled Man, which many in the industry felt that it should have been nominated for some sort of award. Unfortunately, this being a comic book movie, it got overlooked. And as with all the previous Marvel Cinematic Universe versions, we of course got a video game based around the movie. This time it was Captain America Super Soldier, which was published by Sega. The game would release on July 15th, 2011 on the Nintendo DS, the PlayStation 3, the Wii, and the Xbox 360. Out of all the Marvel video games based on the movies, this is definitely the best one, as the critics reflected this also. The game has averaged a 7 out of 10. And it does not even really stick to the movie or anything like that. Instead, it goes off and does its own thing for a majority of it. It is a third-person action-adventure game. You definitely spend a lot of time feeling like you are Captain America. And if you are interested in playing any of the MCU-based video games, this is the one I would highly recommend. The film would go on to have its premiere on July 11th of 2011, with the film being screened at San Diego Comic-Con on July 21st of 2011, with a final worldwide release happening in the United States and Canada on July 22nd, 2011. The film would of course go on to become #1 at the box office, opening with $65.1 million, only $0.5 million behind the previous opening of Thor. By the end of its box office run, the movie managed to make $370.6 million on a budget of $140 million. While by today's standards this would be looked at as a failure, Marvel saw this as a victory, considering their ultimate plan was to lead up to the Avengers. And now having the backing of Disney Entertainment and the entire Disney marketing machine, the outlook for the future was bright. And as was customary with Marvel movies at this point, everybody knew to stay after the credits. The people that stayed were treated to a very brief post-credit scene of Captain America in the gym working out and Nick Fury walking up to him and asking him to recruit him. The words "Captain America will return in the Avengers" showed up on the screen, followed by the teaser trailer to the Avengers, which lasted about 45 seconds. Between Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, Thor, and Captain America, the Marvel future looked brighter than ever. But now everybody had their eyes set on the ultimate risk in Hollywood's history. Can Marvel find a director and someone who can put the Avengers on the screen and deliver the goods that so many are afraid of? So join me next episode as we look at the impact and the cultural change and the change to Hollywood that the Avengers would cause. Hey guys, Armin here, just reminding you that this video was made possible thanks to patrons. If you guys are interested in supporting us and making sure we keep the lights on, check out our Patreon where you can join other fans in supporting the CBC, delivering content you guys have come to love and expect. And if you can't do that, give us a like and a subscribe. That goes a long way too.